Hi all. Um, it's cold here, so I'm dressed pretty warmly. But I wanted to respond to one more question from Kanda Arunachalam, which was around progress and measuring progress. How does one measure progress? Um, so many people have this question or conundrum, and he articulated it very nicely, which is to say in golf or tennis or some sports, one can measure progress or see improvement over time, but it's so much harder to see in meditation. So how do you do that? How do you convince your brain not to keep comparing to previous experiences? So one thing to just notice is that we're often um, an analogy with meditation to sports is it's as if we are trying to learn tennis, but every time we play, we're playing a totally random opponent. It could be like a world class player, or it could be a little kid. Um, and and because with meditation, what's happening is that it's not just a totally insular experience, but you are basically learning to navigate the quality of your mind or the quality of your experience, mind and emotions. Um, you're learning to do that while you are basically navigating a rapid. And so some days there are experiences around you, externally or internally, based on memories or things that are happening for you, that might be huge. And some days those aren't there. And so it's an easier journey. Um, and so what we have to contend with is the fact that we're learning the skill in the midst of that turbulence. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And as uh, as you look at your progress or as you look at your journey, to just know that that's the case, and so to be a little kind on yourself. Second is that the tool that we're using to measure or to be aware of our experience is the tool that we're training. And so the repercussions of that are that, for example, when we start our practice, we may not be aware how much our mind wanders or our attention wanders. Uh, and sometimes a few days or weeks or months into meditation, suddenly you feel like, man, I'm so much more distracted than I was when I started. And there's an element of this, which is that we are now more aware of our distraction because we're now more aware of where our attention is. So that's another factor that confounds our attempts at measuring progress. Um, one of the reasons why in recent years it's been a little more easy to convince people, or why people have found it more palatable to engage in meditation is that we have these third person objective measurements like fMRI, like MRI, that can show us changes in our brain. Um, and that's kind of nice to see because it's like a muscle. It's nice to see that, okay, there's something happening here in response uh, to my behavior. It's not just made up in my head. So that's also an interesting. I mean, that doesn't do anything for our moment to moment experience, but it does help us uh, sort of in terms of convincing or in terms of rationalizing to yourself that, like, yes, this practice is kind of developing a skill over time. And then uh, something that uh, that comes across in the Goenka lectures uh, is this idea that when we measure our progress or when we look at our progress, to look at it not as to measure it not by the quality of our experience, because our experience is so dependent on the emotions, the particular terrain that we're traversing right now in life, um, but to look at how we respond to that. Um, and this is also difficult because, again, it's not that our ability to handle emotions is dependent on our ability, but also on the size or the strength of the emotions. Um, but I think I have found, at least for me personally, that for example, some sits that I do, I'll sit down and I'll be aware of intense, uh, unpleasant sensations during the sit. Um, but that's separate from the equanimity of the sit or my ability to be with those. So there are some sits where, I just feel irritated and agitated, and I might be even sitting just for 10 or 20 minutes, but it's a very agitated sit. Uh, and there are some sits that, maybe an hour long sit in which I'm experiencing a lot of pain uh, in my body. And yet there's a lot of stillness, both physically and mentally, through that pain, where yeah. And so that's a sign to me that during those moments, I'm able to observe that and bear witness to it without necessarily getting caught up in it. So, so yeah, how to answer the question of, um, how do you not compare one sit to the next? Uh, I think this just comes with experience. Um, One thing to note that I found is that, and I mentioned this in a previous video, when I say to myself, when I notice that I'm saying to myself, oh man, today's sit is so difficult. Yesterday's sit was great. In that moment, I know that in yesterday's sit, maybe it was filled with pleasant sensations and I built up a sense of attachment to those. And so now, when those pleasant sensations have disappeared, that the remnants of that attachment, the craving for that attachment that I've built up, is what I'm experiencing right now. And so, so that's one way that I have noticed that I relate to previous sits. Uh, Again, when I'm frustrated that this sit is not as pleasant or good as as a previous sit, that's a sign to me that the previous sit included some attachment to the pleasant sensations. Um, I'm going to pause for a moment in case someone has something to say in the chat, but also to see if there's anything else I want to add. Yeah, I think that's it. I think I will pause here. And if I think of something to say, we'll do that in another video. Thanks.